Next, I'd like to look at the neural mechanisms of attention. Now, there are several systems of attention, and they span multiple lobes of the brain. They span subcortical regions, so regions that are deep inside the brain, and they might involve different neurotransmitters. Now, following the model of Peterson and Posner, there are at least the three main mechanisms of attention, although they do say that there might be more. The first one is alerting. Now, alerting, you can think of it a bit like a warning signal, a non-specific process by which a state of rest gets replaced by a general state of heightened arousal, heightened vigilance in preparation for a task or a stimulus. Note that this is a general state, meaning you're not preparing for a specific task or a specific aspect of a stimulus. You're just heightening the whole system ready for a task to come, but it's a non-specific form of attention. Alerting seems to be particularly connected to the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, which has a main nucleus deep inside the brainstem in the so-called locus coeruleus, and then acts via the thalamus, frontal cortex, and parietal cortex. A second mechanism of attention, a separate neurocognitive system of attention, is the one that we have focused on, orienting, what we refer to as selective attention. And this is the process by which sort of attention might be shifted around to select an object, either because you want it, because you have something in mind and you want to focus on something. So this would be an endogenous or a top-down form of attention, or because something interesting just happens and quote unquote holds for your attention, which would be an exogenous or bottom-up form of attention. And this system also appears to rely in particular on acetylcholine, so a specific type of neurotransmitter, and then seems to rely also on parts of the lateral parietal and frontal cortex. Finally, executive attention is a process which tries to monitor and resolve any conflict between competing thoughts, competing feelings, competing responses to some stimulus. And this system seems to be particularly centered on dopamine and on the anterior cingulate, which is a part of frontal cortex, which is deep in the middle of the brain, and lateral prefrontal cortex. Now, I should say, while of course each of these systems is extremely interesting in its own right, and probably I could spend a whole quarter talking about the neurocognitive mechanisms of attention. For our purposes, we will mainly focus on orienting because it is what we have discussed so far. So where does attention, and in our case, orienting specifically, happen in the brain? Well, we have seen that one important aspect of attention, particularly top-down attention, is to prepare you to detect some specific stimulus or some specific feature in the environment. And so it's not too surprising that certain forms of attention have been shown to prepare and to enhance neural activity in specific parts of the brain that are important for processing, some aspect of a stimulus. Just to give you a couple of examples, if you were preparing to detect an auditory stimulus, then you might find that auditory cortex gets enhanced specifically. If you were, anticipating a visual stimulus, then some parts of your visual cortex would probably be enhanced in their activation, and we're going to see an example of this in just a moment. And just to foreshadow what is coming next, the idea is that with respect to, for example, top-down attention, so when you decide to attend to something, also in this endogenous form of attention, where your own mind is driving you to attend to something, the idea is that there's there's a part of your brain in parietal cortex, which I'm highlighting right here. And the job of this area is to activate specific sensory parts of your brain that are important or relevant to, whatever task is about to come, or whatever is the feature that you need to attend to next. So the idea is that this part of the brain might send the signals in this top-down fashion to parts of the brain that are important for processing the stimulus that you're expecting or that you want to focus on. Now, a classic example of this comes from an experiment by Shulman and colleagues in 1999. And they focused on endogenous, so top-down attentional networks. So when you decide, just as I was showing in the previous example, when you decide to look at and to focus on some aspect of the world around you. Now, here's what they did. They showed, imagine that you're the participant and you're looking at a screen, and you would be doing a number of conditions, but we will focus on two: the passive cue condition and the directional cue condition. Now, in the passive cue condition, and you would look at the screen in front of you, and it would look like this. There would be some dots still, and a little square. And what the little square is telling you is you will be shown some dots that move in just a second. You don't have to do anything about it. Just look at them. Okay. So this is what this cue is telling you. So you see this, you understand what it means. Then for a moment, you get this kind of in-between screen, and then you see some dots that move. Okay, for just a fraction of a moment, and then you see another sort of in-between screen, and then we restart. Okay, so this is the passive cue condition. Really, all that you're doing is you're being told, just look at the dots when you see them move. So just look at these dots moving, nothing else. Now, in contrast, one of the other conditions was the so-called directional cue condition. Now, what differed here, the rest of the task is identical. What differed was the cue period. Instead of getting this passive cue that tells you don't do anything, just look at the stimuli, you would get a cue that cues a certain direction. Notice, nothing is moving around. All you're getting is this cue that is telling you, you're going to see some movement in just a moment. As quickly and as accurately as possible, you have to tell us whether the dots are moving in the same direction as the arrow. So the idea is that by virtue of doing this, this task is making you load up your system, getting you ready to attend to movement in a certain direction. So this is the signal to your top-down endogenous attention to really focus on movement towards the right. So you would see this, then you would see this kind of in-between screen, and now you would see dots move. And as quickly and as accurately as possible, you would press to tell whether the motion of these dots matches the arrow. Then you'd get another in-between screen, and then you would restart. So again, the idea is that we're trying to load up, we're trying to get participants to engage their top-down attention so that we can look at it. And indeed, Shulman and colleagues were particularly interested in what happened here before you see any movement. How is your top-down attention modulating your brain? Now, before looking at the effect of attention, however, it is important to characterize what parts of the brain in these participants respond to motion. So when they looked at what parts of the brain were active when participants were viewing dots that were moving, they found a part of the brain in the temporal lobes, often referred to as MT, as in middle temporal lobe. It's a part of the brain that is really nearby the occipital cortex, which would be back here, and is part of the ventral stream, so the so-called WOT stream. And it's important, it has been shown several times to be very important for detecting, processing, and understanding motion. In fact, This piece of the brain is so intimately linked to understanding and perceiving motion that if somebody were to have a lesion in that part of the brain, they risk developing akinesia, which is the inability to understand motion. And suddenly the world, instead of being a continuous flux, becomes a series of still images. So not too surprising, but very important to know that this, in these participants, is the part of the brain important for viewing motion. So the next question is, when you're not seeing motion, but you know that you will next have to attend to motion, how are you modulating? How is your brain achieving top-down modulation? So how is it deploying attention? And so to do this, they compared brain activity while participants were looking at the directional cue. So brain activity when they're thinking, okay, motion towards the right, motion towards the right. So when you're deploying your top-down attention, compared to just the passive cue. So when you're just looking at the cue, at the visual display, but there's no top-down attention to exert. Now, when comparing the two cues, it turns out that the middle temporal lobes, I'm sorry, there's a typo on my slide, the middle temporal lobes, MT, were more active when participants were viewing the directional cue, the one with the arrow, compared to the neutral cue, compared to the passive cue. And of course, note that here there is no motion happening. So any activation inside MT has to be the result of a top-down activation. Nothing is moving on the screen. So if MT, which is important for motion, is active, it must mean that this is the result of a top-down process. So there's some part of the brain that is enhancing activity in MT so that you can detect faster the presence of motion. Of course, the question is, well, what is that region? Turns out that region is in the parietal cortex up here. So this would be part of the where visual stream, the dorsal visual stream. And parietal cortex, there's one part typically referred to as the intraparietal sulcus, abbreviated IPS, which is very important, which seems to be the part of the brain that is sending this top-down influence. And the reason the authors interpreted that area this way is that this part of the brain typically does not respond to motion. So the only other thing it could be responding to in this design is the allocation of attention. So these findings suggest that attention is separate from perception of something and seems to be implemented when it's in this top-down fashion by a specific part of the brain in parietal cortex, in the intraparietal sulcus. And in fact, as we're going to see in just a moment, there's an additional part of the brain a little further to the front in frontal cortex, referred to as the frontal eye field, that is also very important for top-down attention. Now, one cohesive view of how the brain implements orienting or selective attention was proposed in 2002 by Corbett and Schulman. And in particular, Corbett and Schulman realized that orienting is probably composed of the dynamic interaction of two separate but interacting networks. One, the dorsal attention network, or DAN, is really important for endogenous top-down deployment of attentional resources. So this is the case when you want to focus on some stimulus or some feature of a stimulus, and maybe you want to then respond to a specific feature of a stimulus. So these so-called stimulus response selection. And so the system seems to include bilaterally, so both on the right and the left hemispheres, both parietal regions and frontal regions. Parietal regions are in particular the IPS, the intraparietal sulcus, which we saw in the Schulman experiments just a moment ago. And it extends also in the SPL, or the superior parietal lobule. And don't worry, all these acronyms are spelled out in the book. So the DAN the dorsal attention network seems to rely on this parietal area and frontal eye fields. And again, both in the right hemisphere and in the left hemisphere. Now, on the other hand, there's a second network, which the so-called ventral attention network, VAN, which is important more for reorienting in a bottom-up manner your attention towards some external stimulus. Now, this is what happens, for example, when some potentially important sensory information, say a loud alarm or a sudden movement, can attract your attention regardless of what you're thinking of. So whatever task you're engaged in. So in the sense, the role of the ventral attention network of this neurocognitive system might be to sort of take you away from whatever your top-down attention is focusing on in favor of evaluating some sudden stimulus that has just appeared. So you can think of this as Corbetta and Schulman frame it. You can think of this a bit like a circuit breaker type network, which can trip the top-down endogenous attention system to allow you to reorient towards something important that has just happened in your environment. So in this sense, the DAN, the dorsal attention network, is really your effortful top-down, I want to focus on this endogenous type attention or type selective attention, whereas the ventral attention network seems to subserve the more bottom-up, the exogenously driven. So when there's something outside that is driving your attention, that kind of process. And so these two processes together seem to be one way of understanding the neurocognitive circuitry of visual attention or orienting or selective attention.